What happens when a single act of courage exposes decades of hidden truths? When the very person society deemed disposable becomes the one who saves everything that matters. This is the story of how one flood didn't just wash away a plantation, it revealed the true foundation upon which an entire world was built. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will change how you see history. The morning of September 15th, 1847, dawned deceptively calm over Riverside Plantation in rural Georgia. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under a pale sky, and the morning mist clung to the Chattahoochee River like a gentle embrace. But nature, as Thomas Jefferson once wrote, feels never as peaceful as it appears. Samuel, a 28-year-old enslaved man, had been awake since before dawn. His calloused hands moved methodically as he repaired a broken fence post near the main house. 3 days of relentless rain had softened the earth, and the river had been rising steadily. But no one, not Master Harrison, not the overseer, not even the oldest field hands, could have predicted what was coming. Samuel's powerful frame bore the scars of 15 years of plantation labor, but his spirit remained unbroken. His father had been a blacksmith before being sold away when Samuel was just 10, and he had passed down not just his physical strength, but also his unwavering sense of dignity. "Remember, son," his father had whispered during their last embrace, "they can own your body, but your soul belongs to God alone." The fence post Samuel was repairing had been damaged by Jupiter, Master Harrison's prized stallion, who had grown increasingly agitated over the past few days. Animals often sensed natural disasters before humans, and Jupiter's restlessness should have been a warning. But the white inhabitants of Riverside Plantation had long ago stopped paying attention to such signs, believing their mastery over the land made them immune to its whims. "Samuel!" The sharp voice of Overseer Mitchell cut through the humid air. "Master Harrison wants you to secure the livestock. River's getting mighty high." Mitchell was a thin, cruel man from North Carolina who had arrived at Riverside 2 years earlier with a reputation for breaking rebellious slaves. He carried a leather whip coiled at his belt and used it liberally, believing that fear was the only effective tool for managing enslaved labor. His pale eyes held a constant malice that made even the most compliant workers nervous. Samuel nodded silently, his dark eyes scanning the swollen waters in the distance. He had lived on this plantation for 15 years, brought here as a boy of 13 after his mother died of fever in the cramped slave quarters of a tobacco farm in Virginia. He knew every inch of this land, every mood of the river, every sound the wind made through the ancient oak trees that bordered the property. And today, something felt different, a tension in the air that spoke of approaching catastrophe. Inside the grand white mansion, Miss Catherine Harrison, the master's 19-year-old daughter, sat by her bedroom window, watching the rain begin to fall again. She was a delicate young woman with auburn hair and green eyes, educated in Charleston at one of the finest finishing schools in the South. Unlike many of her peers, Catherine had always felt uncomfortable with the harsh realities of plantation life, though she'd never dared voice such thoughts aloud. Her education had exposed her to literature and philosophy that occasionally contradicted the social order she'd been born into. She had read Harriet Martineau's writings on slavery and found herself troubled by the contradictions between Christian teachings about human dignity and the reality of owning other human beings. But such thoughts were dangerous for a young Southern woman, and she kept them locked away in the privacy of her own mind. "Catherine, dear, come away from that window," called her mother, Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, from the hallway. "The weather is dreadful, and you'll catch your death." Mrs. Harrison was a woman shaped by the expectations of her class and time. Born into Charleston society, she had married William Harrison when she was just 17, moving to this remote plantation with romantic notions about rural life that had long since been tempered by reality. She managed the household with an iron fist wrapped in velvet gloves, maintaining the elaborate social rituals that separated the plantation elite from both poor whites and enslaved blacks. But Catherine remained transfixed by the scene outside. She could see Samuel working near the stables, his movements efficient despite the worsening conditions. She had noticed him before, not in any improper way, but because he carried himself differently than the other enslaved people. There was a quiet dignity in his bearing that even the cruelest treatment couldn't break. She had once seen him comfort a child who had been separated from her mother during a slave auction, his gentle words and protective presence offering solace in a moment of unimaginable trauma. By noon, the rain had transformed from a steady drizzle to a torrential downpour. The river, normally a peaceful boundary of the plantation, had become a roaring beast, its muddy waters climbing higher with each passing hour. The sound was ominous, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Master William Harrison, a stern man in his 50s, stood on the front porch with his guest, Colonel James Whitmore, who had arrived the previous evening for a business discussion about cotton prices. Harrison was a third-generation plantation owner, inheriting Riverside from his father, along with its 200 enslaved workers, and 3 Saisuazuro acres of prime cotton land. He prided himself on being a benevolent master, providing adequate food and shelter while maintaining strict discipline. "Never seen it this bad," Harrison muttered, his usual confidence shaken. "Been here 23 years, and the river's never come this close to the house." Colonel Whitmore, a heavy-set man with graying whiskers and holdings in Alabama, squinted through the rain. His own plantation had been devastated by flooding 2 years earlier, an experience that had cost him nearly half his enslaved workforce and left him deeply in debt. "Perhaps we should consider moving to higher ground, William. My plantation in Alabama flooded 2 years back. Lost everything, crops, livestock, even some of the quarters. Took me 2 years to recover financially." But Harrison's pride wouldn't allow such a retreat. The mansion had been built by his grandfather in 1805, its imposing columns and wraparound porches designed to project power and permanence. "This house has stood for 40 years. It'll take more than a little water to move a Harrison." Meanwhile, in the slave quarters, families huddled together as water began seeping under their doors. The quarters consisted of 20 small cabins arranged in 2 rows, each housing multiple families in cramped conditions. The buildings were poorly constructed, with gaps in the walls that let in wind and rain even during normal weather. Old Moses, the eldest among them at 72, shook his head grimly. Moses had been born into slavery in South Carolina and had survived the Middle Passage in his mother's womb. He had seen hurricanes, floods, droughts, and human cruelty that would break lesser spirits, but he had also witnessed moments of unexpected grace and humanity. "This ain't natural," he whispered to Sarah, Samuel's closest friend among the enslaved community. "River's angry about something." Sarah, a woman of 35 who worked in the main house as a seamstress and occasional cook, glanced toward the mansion. She had been born on the plantation and had watched Samuel grow from a frightened boy into a man of remarkable character. "Samuel's still out there trying to save their animals while our own children got wet feet." As if summoned by her words, Samuel appeared in the doorway, soaked to the bone but carrying little Emma, a 5-year-old girl whose cabin had begun flooding. Emma's mother had died in childbirth, and the community had collectively raised her, but Samuel had always shown her special attention, perhaps seeing in her something of the sister he had lost to disease years earlier. "Everyone needs to move to the main house," he announced, his voice calm but urgent. "The quarters won't hold much longer." It was an unprecedented suggestion. Enslaved people entering the main house except for work was strictly forbidden by both law and custom. The mansion was a sacred space of white privilege, its very architecture designed to reinforce social hierarchies. But as another crash of thunder shook the earth and the water rose visibly higher, even the most rigid social boundaries began to seem less important than survival. By 3 o'clock, the impossible was happening. The Chattahoochee River had burst its banks completely, and water was rushing across the plantation grounds like a brown, debris-filled ocean. Furniture, fence posts, and entire sections of buildings floated past the main house windows. The carefully maintained gardens that Mrs. Harrison had tended for 20 years disappeared under the muddy torrent. Samuel stood in the mansion's kitchen, where Mrs. Harrison had reluctantly allowed the enslaved families to take shelter. The kitchen was a large room with a massive fireplace and heavy wooden tables, normally the domain of Aunt Bessie, the elderly cook who had served the Harrison family for 3 decades. Now it was crowded with frightened families, their few possessions clutched in their arms. He watched through the window as the world he'd known for 15 years disappeared under the flood. The cotton fields that had been his daily workplace, the oak trees where he had sometimes found moments of peace, the small garden plot where he had grown vegetables to supplement the meager rations, all of it was vanishing beneath the relentless water. "Lord, have mercy," whispered Aunt Bessie, her weathered hands clasped in prayer. "It's like the end times." But Samuel's attention was drawn to something else. Through the chaos of wind and rain, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a woman's scream coming from somewhere outside. It was high-pitched and desperate, cutting through the roar of the storm like a knife. He rushed to the front window and saw the unthinkable. Miss Catherine was in the water. She had been on the second-floor balcony when a massive section of the house's east wing collapsed, taking part of the balcony with it. The impact had thrown her into the churning flood, and now she was being swept away by the violent current, her white dress a stark contrast against the muddy torrent. Her arms flailed desperately as she tried to stay afloat, but the weight of her waterlogged clothing was pulling her down. "Miss Catherine!" Mrs. Harrison's anguished cry echoed through the house as she appeared at the window. "Someone help her, please!" Master Harrison and Colonel Whitmore stood frozen, the reality of the situation overwhelming them. The current was too strong, the debris too dangerous. Broken lumber, uprooted trees, and pieces of destroyed buildings created a deadly obstacle course in the rushing water. It would be suicide to attempt a rescue, but Samuel was already moving. Without a word, without hesitation, he pushed past the shocked white faces and ran toward the front door. Behind him, he heard Overseer Mitchell shout, "Boy, you get back here! That's not your concern!" Samuel didn't stop. He couldn't stop. In that moment, something deeper than fear, deeper than the conditioning of years of oppression, drove him forward. He saw not a white woman or a master's daughter. He saw a human being in mortal danger, and every instinct in his body demanded that he act. The front door slammed behind him as he plunged into the storm, leaving behind the safety of the house and entering a world transformed by nature's fury. The moment Samuel stepped outside, the full fury of the flood hit him like a physical blow. The wind drove rain into his face with stinging force, and the water around the house was already knee-deep and rising fast. Debris, broken lumber, household items, even a chicken coop, swept past him in the churning current. The familiar landscape of Riverside Plantation had been transformed into an alien world of brown water and floating wreckage. But his eyes remained fixed on the white dress bobbing desperately in the distance. Catherine was perhaps 50 yards away, being carried toward a cluster of fallen trees that could either save her or trap her beneath the surface forever. The current was moving faster than a man could run, and with each passing second, she was being swept further from safety. Samuel had learned to swim in this very river as a boy, back when it was a place of peace rather than destruction. His father had taught him during stolen moments on Sunday afternoons when the overseer's attention was elsewhere. "Water can be your friend or your enemy," his father had said. "Respect it, understand it, and it might just save your life someday." Samuel had never imagined those words would prove so prophetic, but this wasn't the gentle Chattahoochee he knew. This was a monster that had devoured the landscape. The water was thick with mud and debris, moving with a violence that spoke of nature's awesome power. Tree branches reached up from the depths like grasping fingers, and the current created whirlpools and eddies that could trap even the strongest swimmer. He waded deeper, feeling the current's pull grow stronger with each step. The water reached his waist, then his chest. Around him, the plantation was disappearing. The slave quarters were completely submerged now, only their rooftops visible like small islands in a brown sea. The cotton gin, the smokehouse, the stables, all the infrastructure of plantation life was being swept away as if it had never existed. "Samuel, no!" Sarah's voice carried from the main house window, but he couldn't turn back now. He could see other faces pressed against the glass. Old Moses with his weathered features creased in worry, Aunt Bessie with her hands clasped in prayer, even some of the white family members watching in stunned silence. A piece of the barn's roof came spinning toward him, its metal edges glinting dangerously in the grey light. Samuel dove under the water to avoid it, the muddy liquid burning his eyes and filling his mouth with the taste of earth and decay. When he surfaced gasping, Catherine was closer, but also in greater danger. She had managed to grab onto a floating beam, but her strength was clearly failing. The beam she clung to was part of the plantation's cotton press, a massive piece of machinery that had been torn from its foundations by the flood's power. The irony wasn't lost on Samuel. The very tool that had processed the cotton he and others had picked was now the only thing keeping his master's daughter alive. The current was carrying them both toward the grove of oak trees that marked the plantation's eastern boundary. In normal times, it was a beautiful spot where Catherine often walked, reading books in the dappled shade. Samuel had sometimes seen her there during his work, always maintaining the proper distance, but occasionally catching glimpses of the titles she carried: poetry, novels, even some philosophical works that seemed unusual for a young southern woman. Now, those same trees created a deadly maze of branches and debris. The flood had uprooted some of the smaller oaks entirely, while the larger ones stood like ancient sentinels, their massive trunks creating barriers that could crush anything caught against them. Samuel fought against the current, using every technique his father had taught him before they were separated and sold to different plantations. He angled his body, using the water's force rather than fighting it directly, swimming in a diagonal pattern that gradually brought him closer to Catherine. His muscles burned with the effort, and his lungs ached from the exertion, but he pressed on. When he was 10 feet away, their eyes met across the churning water. The terror in her green eyes was unmistakable, but there was something else, a flicker of recognition, of hope. In that moment, the artificial barriers between them seemed to dissolve. She wasn't the master's daughter, and he wasn't a slave. They were simply two human beings fighting for survival in the face of nature's wrath. "Hold on," he shouted over the roar of the flood. "I'm coming." Catherine's grip on the beam was slipping. Her heavy dress, soaked with water, was pulling her down like an anchor. The elaborate corset and multiple petticoats that marked her status as a lady had become instruments of potential death. She tried to respond, but water filled her mouth, and she began to cough violently. Samuel reached her just as her fingers lost their hold. She went under, and for a terrifying moment he couldn't see her. The muddy water was opaque, hiding everything beneath its surface. Then her hand broke through, grasping desperately at nothing, and Samuel's heart nearly stopped. He dove down, his eyes burning from the muddy water, and found her. His arms encircled her waist, and he kicked upward with all his strength, breaking the surface with both of them gasping for air. Catherine was unconscious for a moment, her face pale and her lips tinged with blue, but then she coughed violently, expelling water from her lungs. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady despite their desperate situation. "Don't fight the water. Let me do the work." Catherine nodded weakly, her survival instincts overriding years of social conditioning. In this moment, Samuel wasn't a slave and she wasn't a master's daughter. They were simply two human beings fighting for their lives. Her hands gripped his shoulders, and he could feel her trembling from cold and fear. But their ordeal was far from over. The current was carrying them directly toward the oak grove, where broken branches jutted from the water like spears. Samuel had to make a choice: try to fight the current and risk both their lives, or ride it through the trees and hope they could navigate the deadly obstacles. He chose to trust his knowledge of the land. Even underwater and transformed by the flood, he knew these trees. He had climbed them as a boy, hidden among their branches when the overseer's anger grew too dangerous, carved his initials in their bark during moments of stolen freedom. That intimate knowledge of the terrain might be their only hope. The first massive oak loomed before them, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter. Samuel could see the current would carry them directly into it unless he acted quickly. He adjusted their position, using Catherine's body as a counterweight, and managed to catch a submerged branch that swung them around the tree's base. "Take a deep breath," he told Catherine. "We're going under." They plunged beneath the surface, just as a massive branch swept over their heads. Samuel navigated by feel and memory, pulling Catherine through the submerged maze. His lungs burned, and he could feel her struggling against panic, but he held her tight and kept moving. The water was darker here, filtered through the canopy of leaves and branches, and the current created treacherous eddies that could trap them. A sharp pain shot through Samuel's shoulder as a broken branch scraped against him, tearing his shirt and leaving a bloody gash. But he didn't let go of Catherine, didn't slow his desperate progress through the underwater forest. He could feel her body going limp in his arms and knew she was running out of air. When they surfaced on the far side of the grove, both were exhausted, but they were alive. The current had carried them nearly a quarter mile from the main house, but it had also deposited them in shallower water near what had once been the plantation's vegetable garden. Samuel's feet found purchase on the muddy ground, and he was able to stand, still supporting Catherine. She was conscious but weak, her face pale and her breathing labored. Her elaborate hairstyle had come undone, and her auburn hair hung in wet tangles around her shoulders. The fine dress that had marked her status was now torn and stained with mud, making her look more like a refugee than a plantation mistress. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the effort. She tried to nod, but her legs buckled. The ordeal had drained her strength completely, and the cold water had left her shivering uncontrollably. Without hesitation, Samuel lifted her in his arms, carrying her toward higher ground. Behind them, the main house was barely visible through the rain, but he could see figures gathered at the windows. As they reached the small hill where the plantation's chapel stood, one of the few buildings still above water, Catherine spoke for the first time since the rescue. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Why did you risk your life for me?" Samuel paused, looking down at the young woman in his arms. How could he explain that in the moment he saw her in danger, all the artificial barriers between them had simply ceased to exist? How could he tell her that his mother had taught him that every life had value, even when the world insisted otherwise? "Because it was right," he said simply. They took shelter in the chapel, a small wooden building that had somehow withstood the flood's initial assault. The chapel was a simple structure, built by the enslaved community themselves under the supervision of a traveling preacher. It served both the white and black populations of the plantation, though at different times and with different messages about their respective places in God's plan. Samuel set Catherine down gently on one of the rough wooden pews and found some dry cloth from the altar to help warm her. The chapel was sparse but clean, with a simple wooden cross hanging above the pulpit and a few worn Bibles on a small table. Sunlight filtered through the single stained glass window, a gift from Mrs. Harrison, casting colored patterns on the floor. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the chapel, something profound was happening. For the first time in their lives, Samuel and Catherine were speaking as equals, the artificial hierarchy of their world temporarily washed away by the flood. "I don't even know your full name," Catherine said, her voice stronger now. "Samuel Washington," he replied. "My mother named me after the first president, though I don't reckon he would have approved." Catherine managed a weak smile. "Samuel Washington, I've seen you working around the plantation. You're different from the others." "Different how?" "You carry yourself like you know your own worth." It was a dangerous thing for her to say, and they both knew it. In their world, an enslaved person who knew their worth was considered a threat to the social order. But in this small chapel, with the world literally washing away outside, old rules seemed less important than honest conversation. "My mother taught me that," Samuel said, "before she died. She said no man could take away what God put inside you, no matter what they did to your body." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, processing this glimpse into a world she had never truly considered. "I've never thought about. I've never considered what it must be like." "To be owned?" Samuel finished gently. She nodded, tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I know that's not enough, but I'm sorry." It was the first time anyone from the Harrison family had ever apologized to him for anything. Samuel didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded. The moment hung between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and the possibility of something new. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, but both of them knew that when they returned to the main house, everything would change. The question was, how? As the storm finally began to subside near evening, Samuel and Catherine made their way back toward the main house. The landscape they traversed was unrecognizable, a muddy wasteland dotted with debris, and the skeletal remains of buildings. The cotton fields that had been the plantation's pride were now a brown lake stretching to the horizon, with only the tops of fence posts visible like grave markers in a flooded cemetery. The journey back was treacherous. Samuel supported Catherine as they navigated around sinkholes and debris fields, their progress slow and careful. The water had receded enough to reveal the full extent of the devastation: overturned carriages, scattered farm equipment, and the bodies of livestock that hadn't escaped the flood's fury. The smell of mud and decay hung heavy in the air. When they appeared on the front porch, both muddy and exhausted, the reaction was immediate and complex. Mrs. Harrison rushed to embrace her daughter, tears streaming down her face, while Master Harrison stood frozen, his expression unreadable. The other enslaved families who had taken shelter in the house pressed against the windows, their faces showing a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Catherine, oh my dear girl, we thought we'd lost you," Mrs. Harrison sobbed, holding her daughter tight. Her elaborate dress was stained with tears and worry, and her usually perfect hair hung in disheveled strands around her face. But it was Colonel Whitmore who voiced what everyone was thinking. "Good God, William, that boy saved your daughter's life." The word boy hung in the air like a challenge. Samuel, standing quietly to the side, was clearly a man, 28 years old, powerfully built, and possessing a dignity that the day's events had only magnified. Yet the social conventions of their world demanded he be diminished, made smaller, kept in his place. Overseer Mitchell, his face red with anger and confusion, stepped forward. His authority had been undermined by the day's events, and he was desperate to reassert control. "Samuel, you had no business leaving your post. You could have been killed, and then where would we be? Down a good worker for nothing." "For nothing?" The voice that spoke was Catherine's, and it carried a strength that surprised everyone, including herself. "He saved my life, Mr. Mitchell. How is that nothing?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. In the slave quarters, families were emerging from the main house, assessing the damage to their homes. They had witnessed the rescue through the windows, and word was spreading quickly through their community. Samuel's heroic act was being discussed in hushed tones, with some seeing it as an inspiration and others as a dangerous precedent. Old Moses approached slowly, his weathered face showing a mixture of pride and concern. He had lived through enough to know that heroic acts by enslaved people often brought unwanted attention and harsh consequences. "Samuel," he said quietly, "you did a brave thing today. But brave things can be dangerous for folks like us." Samuel understood the warning. In their world, enslaved people who stood out, who demonstrated capabilities that challenged the established order, often faced harsh consequences. Rebellious slaves were sold away from their families, whipped into submission, or worse. But as he looked at the faces around him, some grateful, some confused, some openly hostile, he realized that something fundamental had shifted. Master Harrison finally found his voice. "Samuel," he said, his tone carefully controlled, You did well today, I won't forget it." It was perhaps the closest thing to gratitude the man could manage, but it felt hollow in the face of what had actually occurred. Samuel had risked everything to save Harrison's most precious possession, his daughter, and the best he could offer was, "You did well." But Catherine wasn't finished. The experience in the chapel had awakened something in her, a clarity of vision that made the old social arrangements seem suddenly arbitrary and cruel. "Father, Samuel didn't just do well, he was heroic. He dove into that flood without thinking of his own safety. He carried me through waters that could have killed us both. He saved my life when no one else could or would." Colonel Whitmore nodded approvingly, his own plantation experience giving him perspective on what he had witnessed. "The girl's right, William. I've seen grown men freeze in situations like that. What this man did. It takes real courage, the kind of courage we claim to value above all else." The word man was deliberate and everyone heard it. In a world where enslaved people were legally considered property, referring to Samuel as a man was a small but significant act of recognition. It challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which their society was built. As the evening progressed and the immediate crisis passed, the implications of the day's events began to sink in. The plantation had suffered massive damage. The slave quarters were destroyed, much of the livestock was lost, and the cotton crop was ruined. The financial losses would be staggering, potentially threatening the plantation's survival. But more than that, the social fabric of their small world had been torn and would need to be rewoven. In the kitchen, where the enslaved families were preparing a meal from whatever supplies remained dry, the conversation was intense and fraught with uncertainty. "Samuel done something today that's going to change things," said Sarah, her voice low but urgent. "Question is, change them how?" Aunt Bessie, who had worked in the main house for 30 years and had seen the subtle shifts in white attitudes over time, shook her head grimly. "White folks don't like being shown up by colored folks, even when we're saving their lives. Samuel better be careful." But Emma, the little girl Samuel had carried to safety earlier, looked up from where she was helping sort vegetables. Her innocent perspective cut through the adult's fears with startling clarity. He was like a hero in the stories Mama tells. Heroes are supposed to save people. "Heroes in stories don't get whipped for being heroic," old Moses said sadly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. Meanwhile, in the main house, a different conversation was taking place. Catherine sat in the parlor with her parents and Colonel Whitmore, a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of hot tea in her hands. The familiar surroundings, the elegant furniture, the family portraits, the symbols of wealth and status, seemed somehow different now, less solid and permanent than they had that morning. "I keep thinking about what he said," Catherine murmured, her voice distant as she relived the experience. "When I asked him why he risked his life for me, he said, because it was right. Not because he had to, not because I was his master's daughter, but because it was right." Mrs. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her worldview challenged by her daughter's words. "Catherine, dear, you've been through a terrible ordeal. Perhaps you shouldn't dwell on—" "No, Mother, I need to dwell on it. I need to understand it." Catherine's voice grew stronger, more determined. "We've been taught our whole lives that they're different from us, that they don't feel things the way we do, that they're somehow less human. But what Samuel did today, it was the most human thing I've ever witnessed." Colonel Whitmore leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. His own experiences managing enslaved labor had given him insights that many plantation owners preferred to ignore. "You know, William, I've been thinking about what happened today. That man, Samuel, he demonstrated qualities that we claim to value above all others. Courage, selflessness, quick thinking under pressure. In any other context, we'd call him a hero." Master Harrison's jaw tightened, his discomfort evident. The day's events had forced him to confront contradictions he had spent years avoiding. "James, I appreciate what he did, truly. But we can't forget the natural order of things. If we start treating the slaves like heroes, where does it end?" "Maybe," Catherine said quietly, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised them all. "It ends with us treating them like human beings." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond that parlor. Mrs. Harrison gasped audibly, her hand flying to her throat, while Master Harrison's face darkened with anger and confusion. "Catherine, you will not speak such nonsense in this house," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of generations of plantation masters. "What happened today was unusual circumstances, but it doesn't change the fundamental realities of our society." But Catherine had seen those fundamental realities washed away in the flood, and she was no longer sure they were as solid as her father believed. The experience in the chapel, the honest conversation with Samuel, had opened her eyes to possibilities she had never considered. Later that night, as the household settled into an uneasy sleep, Samuel stood outside the damaged slave quarters, looking up at the stars that had emerged as the clouds cleared. The physical storm was over, but he sensed that an emotional and social storm was just beginning. The other enslaved workers had gathered around him, seeking reassurance and guidance in the aftermath of the day's dramatic events. Sarah approached him quietly, her expression troubled. "You know they're going to make you pay for this somehow," she said. "White folks don't like being in debt to colored folks. Makes them feel uncomfortable." Samuel nodded, understanding the truth in her words. "I know, but I couldn't let her drown, Sarah. I just couldn't." "I know you couldn't. That's what makes you who you are." but it's also what makes you dangerous to them. As if to prove her point, Overseer Mitchell emerged from the shadows, his face hard in the moonlight. His authority had been challenged by the day's events, and he was determined to reassert control before things spiraled further out of hand. "Samuel," he said, his voice cold and threatening, "tomorrow we start rebuilding, and things are going to go back to the way they were before. You understand me?" Samuel met his gaze steadily, his own dignity undiminished by the threat. "I understand what you're saying, Mr. Mitchell." "Good, because heroes don't pick cotton, and cotton is what keeps this plantation running. Don't let today's incident give you ideas above your station." But as Mitchell walked away, Samuel realized that something inside him had changed during those moments in the flood. He had seen himself reflected in Catherine's eyes, not as property, but as a person. He had felt his own power, his own worth, his own capacity for choice. The artificial barriers that had seemed so solid and permanent had proven to be surprisingly fragile when challenged by genuine human need. And once a man has seen himself clearly, it becomes very difficult to pretend to be invisible again. The flood had indeed washed away more than buildings and crops. It had exposed the human foundations upon which their entire world rested, and revealed that those foundations were far more complex and fragile than anyone had imagined. 3 weeks after the flood, Riverside Plantation was slowly rebuilding, but the changes went far deeper than new structures and replanted fields. The social earthquake that began with Samuel's rescue of Catherine continued to send aftershocks through every aspect of plantation life, creating tensions and possibilities that no one had anticipated. The most visible change was in Catherine herself. The young woman who had returned from Charleston with romantic notions about plantation life had been replaced by someone who asked uncomfortable questions and challenged long-held assumptions. Her near-death experience and subsequent conversation with Samuel in the chapel had fundamentally altered her understanding of the world around her. "Father, I want to learn to read and write properly," she announced one morning at breakfast, her voice steady despite the revolutionary nature of her request, "and I want to teach the children in the quarters." Master Harrison nearly choked on his coffee, the cup clattering against the saucer as he set it down with shaking hands. "Catherine, that's illegal. Teaching slaves to read is against the law in Georgia. We could face serious legal consequences." "Then perhaps the law is wrong," she replied calmly, her green eyes meeting his with unwavering determination. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Harrison looked as though she might faint, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Colonel Whitmore, who had extended his stay to help with reconstruction and had become something of a confidant to the family, raised his eyebrows in surprise but said nothing. "Catherine," her mother said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper, "you can't possibly mean that to question the law, to suggest that our entire social order is wrong. It's unthinkable." "I mean exactly that. Samuel saved my life, Mother. He carried me through that flood with more courage and compassion than I've ever seen from any man, white or black. And yet we treat him like he's somehow less than human. How is that right? How is that Christian?" The religious argument was particularly pointed. The Harrison family prided themselves on their Christian faith, attending services every Sunday and supporting missionary work among the heathen populations of Africa. Yet they seemed unable to see the contradiction between their religious beliefs and their treatment of the enslaved people who worked their land. Master Harrison's face was growing red, his anger building like steam in a kettle. "Catherine, you will not speak of such things again. What happened during the flood was an aberration. It doesn't change the natural order that God himself established." But Catherine had seen that natural order dissolve in the muddy waters of the Chattahoochee, and she was no longer convinced it was natural at all. Her education in Charleston had exposed her to ideas about human dignity and natural rights that she was now applying to her own circumstances. "If it's God's natural order," she said quietly, "then why did he give Samuel the courage to save me? Why did he make him capable of such selfless heroism? Doesn't that suggest that perhaps our understanding of his plan is incomplete?" Meanwhile, in the rebuilt slave quarters, Similar conversations were taking place, though with far more caution and awareness of the potential consequences. Samuel's heroic act had inspired something in the enslaved community, a sense of their own dignity and worth that was becoming harder to suppress. The new quarters were slightly better constructed than the old ones, partly due to Samuel's suggestions about drainage and foundation work. His knowledge of the land and his demonstrated leadership abilities had made him an unofficial foreman in the reconstruction effort, a role that both elevated his status and made some of the white overseers nervous. "Samuel showed them what we're really made of," said Marcus, a field hand who had arrived at the plantation just 2 years earlier after being sold from a failing tobacco farm in Virginia. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending to be less than we are." Old Moses shook his head worriedly, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he worked on repairing a fishing net. "Boy, that kind of talk will get you sold downriver faster than you can blink." Samuel did a brave thing, but brave things have consequences. I've seen too many good men disappear because they forgot their place. As if summoned by their conversation, Samuel appeared in the doorway of the communal building where they were gathered. The past 3 weeks had changed him visibly. He carried himself with even greater dignity, and there was something in his eyes, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. But there was also a wariness, an awareness that his actions had marked him as different, potentially dangerous. "I've been thinking," he said, settling down among the group on a rough wooden stool, "about what happened, about what it means for all of us." "What do you think it means?" asked Sarah, her voice carrying both curiosity and concern. Samuel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. He knew that everything he said would be repeated and analyzed, that his words could have consequences far beyond this small gathering. "I think it means we're more than they want us to believe. I think it means that when it really matters, when life and death are on the line, all their rules about who's superior and who's inferior just disappear." "That's dangerous thinking, Samuel," warned Aunt Bessie, her voice heavy with the wisdom of 3 decades in the main house. "I've seen what happens to folks who start believing they're equal to white folks. It don't end well." "Maybe, but you know what's more dangerous? Pretending we're not human when we know we are. Pretending we don't have feelings, thoughts, dreams, just like they do." His words carried weight because of what he had done. Samuel hadn't just talked about dignity and worth. He had demonstrated them in the most dramatic way possible. His actions had forced everyone, black and white, to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of humanity and the artificial barriers that divided people. The impact of his actions was being felt beyond the plantation as well. Word of the rescue had spread throughout the county, carried by Colonel Whitmore and other visitors who had witnessed the event. The story was being told and retold, each version slightly different, but all centering on the same remarkable fact: an enslaved man had risked his life to save his master's daughter. Some white listeners were inspired by the tale, seeing in it proof of the loyalty and devotion they liked to believe their slaves felt for them. They used the story to justify their paternalistic view of slavery, arguing that it demonstrated the mutual affection between masters and slaves. Others were disturbed by it, recognizing that Samuel's actions suggested capabilities and moral reasoning that challenged their justifications for slavery. If enslaved people were capable of such heroism, such selfless courage, then how could they be considered inferior beings suited only for bondage? But perhaps the most significant reaction came from the enslaved communities throughout the region. For them, Samuel's story became something more than an inspiring tale. It became a symbol of their own hidden strength and dignity, proof that they were capable of greatness despite the circumstances of their bondage. 2 months after the flood, the changes at Riverside Plantation had become impossible to ignore. Catherine had indeed begun teaching some of the children to read, despite her father's objections. She did it secretly, meeting with them in the rebuilt chapel on Sunday afternoons when the white family attended services in town. The lessons were simple but revolutionary. Catherine taught the children to recognize letters, to sound out words, to understand that the marks on paper could convey meaning and ideas. For children who had been told they were incapable of learning, these lessons were transformative. Samuel had become an unofficial leader among the enslaved workers, his opinions sought on everything from crop rotation to conflict resolution. Master Harrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of relying on a man he legally owned but could no longer see as merely property. The flood had revealed Samuel's capabilities so dramatically that it was impossible to ignore them. The tension came to a head on a humid August morning when Overseer Mitchell attempted to whip young David, a 16-year-old who had been caught reading one of the books Catherine had given him. David was a bright boy, eager to learn, and his ability to read had made him a target for Mitchell's resentment. "This is what happens when you get ideas above your station," Mitchell snarled, raising his whip high above his head. The leather weapon gleamed in the morning sun, and David cowered beneath it, his young face twisted with fear. But before the lash could fall, Samuel stepped forward. His movement was calm but deliberate, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice calm but firm, "that's not necessary." The overseer whirled around, his face purple with rage. The challenge to his authority was public and unmistakable, witnessed by dozens of workers, both enslaved and free. "You dare tell me what's necessary, boy? I'm telling you that whipping David won't solve anything. He's a good worker, and he's eager to learn. That should be encouraged, not punished." The confrontation drew a crowd. Enslaved workers emerged from the fields, while Catherine and Mrs. Harrison appeared on the main house porch. Master Harrison himself came striding across the yard, his expression thunderous as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of generations of plantation masters. Mitchell pointed his whip at Samuel, his hand shaking with fury. "This slave is interfering with discipline. He needs to be taught his place." But Samuel stood his ground, his dignity unshaken by the threat. "Master Harrison," he said, addressing the plantation owner directly, "I'm not trying to interfere. I'm trying to prevent something that will hurt us all." It was an extraordinary moment. An enslaved man was speaking to his owner as an equal, offering counsel rather than simply obeying orders. The social hierarchy that governed plantation life was being openly challenged, and everyone present understood the significance of what they were witnessing. Master Harrison found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't allow such insubordination to go unpunished. It would undermine his authority completely and potentially inspire other enslaved workers to similar acts of defiance. But he also couldn't forget that this same man had saved his daughter's life, demonstrating courage and judgment that commanded respect. "Samuel," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "you forget yourself." "No, sir," Samuel replied quietly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised everyone present. "I think I'm finally remembering myself." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment when the careful fiction that maintained their social order was being stripped away, revealing the complex humanity beneath. Catherine stepped forward from the porch, her movement drawing all eyes. "Father," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, "Samuel is right. David was reading because I taught him to read. If anyone should be punished, it should be me." Mrs. Harrison gasped, her hand flying to her throat, but Catherine continued with growing confidence. "And I taught him to read because it's wrong to keep people ignorant when they're capable of learning. It's wrong to treat human beings like animals." Master Harrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, his daughter, his wife, his overseer, his slaves, his neighbors who had gathered to watch the confrontation. He was a man caught between worlds, between the old order he had always known and a new reality that his daughter's near death and Samuel's heroism had forced him to confront. The weight of tradition, law, and social expectation pressed down on him like a physical force, but so did the memory of Samuel emerging from the flood, with Catherine in his arms, the image of heroism that had challenged everything he thought he knew about the people he owned. "Everyone back to work," he said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Now." It wasn't a resolution, but it was a reprieve. As the crowd dispersed, Samuel and Catherine's eyes met across the yard. In that brief moment, they shared an understanding that transcended the artificial barriers between them, an acknowledgement that the world was changing, whether the old order was ready or not. That evening, Master Harrison sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and a letter on his desk. The letter was from his brother in Charleston, offering to buy Samuel for his own plantation. The offer was generous, more than Samuel's market value, and it would solve Harrison's immediate problem. "Heard about your heroic slave," the letter read. "Such a man could be valuable in the right circumstances. I'm prepared to offer a generous price. Sometimes it's best to remove sources of disruption before they cause real problems." Harrison stared at the letter for a long time, the whiskey burning his throat as he considered his options. Selling Samuel would solve his immediate problem, removing the source of disruption from his plantation. But it would also mean losing the man who had saved his daughter's life, and Harrison wasn't sure he could live with that betrayal. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Catherine entered without waiting for permission, something she had never done before the flood. The experience had changed her relationship with authority, making her more willing to challenge even her father when she believed it was necessary. "Father, we need to talk," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk with a determination that reminded him uncomfortably of his own mother. "Catherine, if this is about your teaching, it's about Samuel, and it's about us, about who we are and who we want to be." Harrison set down his glass, recognizing that this conversation would require his full attention. "What do you mean?" "I mean that what happened during the flood showed us something important. It showed us that the people we've been treating as property are actually human beings with the same capacity for courage, compassion, and moral reasoning that we have." "Catherine, let me finish, Father, please." Her voice was gentle but determined, carrying a maturity that the flood had forced upon her. "Samuel didn't save my life because he was ordered to. He didn't do it because he was afraid of punishment if he didn't. He did it because he saw another human being in danger and couldn't stand by and watch." Harrison was quiet, his fingers drumming on the desk as he struggled with emotions he couldn't fully name. "That kind of moral courage," Catherine continued, "is exactly what we claim to value most in our society. We celebrate it in our heroes, we teach it to our children, we build monuments to it. But when it comes from someone with dark skin, we try to pretend it doesn't exist. The world isn't that simple, Catherine, isn't it? Samuel showed me that it could be. In that flood, when everything else was stripped away, we were just two people helping each other survive, and it was the most honest moment of my life." Harrison picked up his brother's letter, the paper crackling in his fingers. "I've been offered a chance to sell Samuel. It would solve a lot of problems." Catherine's face went pale, her composure finally cracking. "You can't. Father, you can't sell the man who saved my life." "Then what do you suggest?" "He's becoming a disruptive influence. The other slaves look up to him. He's challenging the overseer's authority. If I don't do something, I'll lose control of this plantation entirely." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke with a conviction that surprised them both. "Then maybe it's time to try a different kind of control. Maybe it's time to try treating people like human beings and see what happens." It was a radical suggestion, one that challenged everything Harrison had been taught about managing enslaved labor. But as he looked at his daughter, this young woman who had been transformed by her encounter with death and salvation, he began to wonder if she might be right. The next morning, Master Harrison made an announcement that would be remembered for generations. Standing before the assembled workers, both enslaved and free, he declared that Riverside Plantation would begin operating under new principles that challenged the very foundations of their society. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice carrying across the yard, "so there will be no more whippings on this plantation. Disputes will be resolved through discussion and fair judgment." The crowd stirred with surprise and confusion, unsure of what they were hearing. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, his voice growing stronger, "those who wish to learn to read and write will be allowed to do so with instruction provided on Sunday afternoons." Overseer Mitchell's face was a mask of fury, but he said nothing, recognizing that his authority had been fundamentally undermined. "And finally," Harrison said, looking directly at Samuel, "I want to establish a council of workers, both free and enslaved, to help make decisions about plantation operations. Samuel Washington will serve as the representative for the enslaved community." The announcement sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. An enslaved man being given an official voice in plantation management was virtually unheard of in Georgia, a direct challenge to the legal and social order that governed their world. As the crowd dispersed, buzzing with excitement and confusion, Samuel approached Master Harrison. The two men stood facing each other, the artificial barriers between them temporarily suspended by the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Sir," Samuel said quietly, "I want to thank you, but I also want to ask, why?" Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then he looked toward the river where the flood had changed all their lives. "Because my daughter was right. What you did during the flood showed me something I'd been trying not to see. You're not property, Samuel. You're a man, and it's time I started treating you like one." It wasn't freedom. Samuel was still legally enslaved, still bound to the plantation by law and circumstance. But it was recognition, and recognition was the first step towards something larger, something that would eventually transform not just Riverside Plantation, but the entire region. 6 months later, Riverside Plantation had become famous throughout Georgia as an experiment in enlightened management. Visitors came from across the South to see how Master Harrison's new methods were working, some hoping to learn from his example, others seeking to prove that such radical changes were doomed to failure. The results spoke for themselves. Despite the flood damage, the plantation was more productive than ever. The workers, treated with dignity and given a voice in operations, had responded with increased effort and innovation. Conflicts were resolved quickly and fairly through the worker council. The literacy classes had produced a generation of enslaved people who could read, write, and think critically about their world. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationships between people. The artificial barriers that had once seemed so solid had proven to be surprisingly fragile when challenged by genuine human connection. White and black workers found themselves collaborating on projects, sharing ideas, and developing mutual respect that transcended the legal boundaries of slavery. Catherine had become a teacher and advocate, using her position to push for further reforms. She had established a small school in the chapel where she taught not just reading and writing, but also mathematics, history, and even basic philosophy. Her students, both enslaved and free children, showed remarkable aptitude when given the opportunity to learn. Samuel had emerged as a leader whose wisdom and judgment were respected by both enslaved and free workers. The worker council he led had implemented innovations in crop rotation, irrigation, and livestock management that had significantly improved the plantation's efficiency. His natural intelligence, no longer suppressed by the brutal constraints of traditional slavery, had flourished in ways that amazed even his supporters. And Master Harrison, despite his initial resistance, had discovered that treating people with dignity was not only morally right, but also practically effective. The plantation's success under the new system had made him something of a celebrity among progressive plantation owners, though it had also earned him criticism from more traditional neighbors. The changes hadn't come without challenges. Several neighboring plantation owners had complained to local authorities about Harrison's dangerous innovations, arguing that his methods threatened the stability of the entire slave system. Overseer Mitchell had quit in disgust, unable to adapt to a system that treated enslaved people as human beings rather than property. But the most serious challenge came from an unexpected source: the state government itself. Georgia's slave codes explicitly forbade teaching enslaved people to read, and Harrison's open defiance of these laws had attracted unwanted attention from authorities in Atlanta. On a cold February morning, a delegation of state officials arrived at Riverside Plantation, led by Judge Marcus Thornfield, a stern advocate of traditional slave management. Their purpose was to investigate reports of illegal activities and determine whether legal action should be taken against Harrison. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Thornfield announced as he stepped down from his carriage, "we're here to investigate serious allegations that you've been violating Georgia's slave codes. Teaching slaves to read is a criminal offense, as is allowing them to participate in plantation management." Harrison stood on his front porch, flanked by Catherine and Colonel Whitmore, who had become a permanent resident and supporter of the plantation's reforms. Behind them, the entire community, enslaved and free, had gathered to witness this confrontation between old and new ways of thinking. "Judge Thornfield," Harrison replied calmly, "I'm aware of the laws, but I'm also aware of my Christian duty to treat all human beings with dignity and respect. The law is clear, sir. Slaves are property, not human beings in the legal sense. Your experiments threaten the very foundation of our society." It was Samuel who stepped forward, his movement causing a stir among the officials. An enslaved man inserting himself into a conversation between white authorities was virtually unprecedented. But Samuel's dignity and bearing commanded attention even from those who opposed everything he represented. "Your Honor," Samuel said, his voice respectful but firm, "may I ask you a question?" Judge Thornfield's face reddened with indignation. "You will not address me directly, slave. Know your place." But Catherine moved to stand beside Samuel, her action sending a clear message about where her loyalties lay. "He has a name, Judge Thornfield. His name is Samuel Washington, and he's the man who saved my life." The judge's expression softened slightly at the mention of the rescue, which had become legendary throughout the region. Even the most ardent defenders of slavery found it difficult to argue against Samuel's heroism. "Very well," Thornfield said grudgingly. "What is your question?" "I want to know," Samuel said, "if you believe that God makes mistakes." The question hung in the air, its implications clear to everyone present. Thornfield, a devout Methodist, found himself caught between his religious beliefs and his social prejudices. "Of course not," he replied. "God is perfect and infallible." "Then why," Samuel continued, "did God give me the ability to read, to think, to feel compassion for others? Why did he give me the courage to risk my life for someone else? If I'm truly just property, as you say, then why did God make me capable of such things?" It was a theological argument that struck at the heart of the religious justifications for slavery. If God had created all people in his image, as Christianity taught, then how could some be considered less than human? Judge Thornfield struggled for an answer, his legal training warring with his religious convictions. "The ways of God are mysterious," he said finally. "It's not for us to question his plan." "But isn't it possible," Catherine interjected, "that his plan includes treating all his children with equal dignity? That maybe our understanding of his will has been incomplete?" The theological debate continued for hours, with other community members joining the discussion. Old Moses shared stories of his own faith journey, describing how his belief in God had sustained him through decades of bondage. Sarah spoke eloquently about the Christian education she had received in secret, and how it had taught her that all souls were equal in God's eyes. Even some of the state officials found themselves moved by these testimonies. Deputy Sheriff William Crawford, a younger man who had come expecting to find a simple case of law-breaking, instead discovered a community that challenged his fundamental assumptions about race and humanity. As the day wore on, it became clear that this was more than a legal investigation. It was a confrontation between two different visions of what American society could become. The old vision, based on racial hierarchy and the treatment of human beings as property, was being challenged by a new vision based on human dignity and mutual respect. On the first anniversary of the flood, the entire plantation community gathered at the rebuilt chapel for a special service. The legal challenges were still pending, and the future remained uncertain. But the community had decided to celebrate how far they had come. Samuel stood before the assembled crowd, masters and slaves, visitors and residents, supporters and skeptics, all united in remembrance of the day that changed everything. The chapel was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and crowding around the open doors. "A year ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the small building, "this river tried to destroy us. It took our homes, our crops, our sense of security. But it also gave us something precious, the chance to see each other clearly, without the barriers that usually divide us." He paused, looking out at the faces before him, Catherine and her family, his fellow enslaved workers, the free laborers, even some neighboring plantation owners who had come to witness this unusual gathering. Judge Thornfield himself sat in the back, his expression unreadable. "What I learned in that flood," Samuel continued, is that when everything else is stripped away, we're all just human beings trying to survive, trying to help each other, trying to do what's right. That's not a lesson I'll ever forget. Catherine stood up from her pew, her movement graceful and determined. And what I learned, she said, is that courage and compassion aren't determined by the color of your skin or the circumstances of your birth. They're determined by the choices you make when it matters most. Master Harrison rose as well, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the crowd. What we all learned is that dignity, true human dignity, can't be bought or sold, granted or taken away. It exists in every person, waiting to be recognized and honored. Judge Thornfield surprised everyone by standing as well. The legal proceedings had forced him to confront his own beliefs, and the experience had been transformative. I came here expecting to find lawbreakers, he said slowly. Instead, I found something that challenges everything I thought I knew about justice and humanity. He paused, struggling with words that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Perhaps it's time for our laws to catch up with our consciences. Perhaps it's time to recognize that some things are more important than legal precedent. As the service concluded and the community dispersed, Samuel walked alone to the riverbank where his life had changed forever. The Chattahoochee flowed peacefully now, its waters clear and gentle. But he would never forget the day it had roared with fury, and in doing so had revealed truth that changed everything. Catherine joined him by the water's edge, the two of them standing in comfortable silence as they watched the sun set over the transformed landscape. The legal battles would continue, and the road ahead remained uncertain, but something fundamental had shifted in their small corner of the world. Do you think it will last? Catherine asked quietly. The changes we've made. Samuel considered the question carefully. I think, he said finally, that once people have seen the truth about human dignity, it becomes very hard to unsee it. The flood showed us who we really are, beneath all the artificial barriers, and that's something that can't be washed away. The flood had ended, but the transformation it began would continue for generations. In saving one life, Samuel had helped save the souls of an entire community. He had shown that even in the darkest circumstances, human dignity could shine through, and that when it did, it had the power to wash away the artificial barriers that divided people and reveal the common humanity that united them. Standing by the peaceful river, Samuel smiled. The water that had once threatened to destroy everything had instead become the source of their salvation. And that, he thought, was perhaps the most powerful lesson of all, that even the most destructive forces could become agents of positive change when met with courage, compassion, and an unwavering belief in human dignity. The story of Riverside Plantation would be told for generations, inspiring others to question the artificial barriers that divided humanity and to recognize the fundamental dignity that connected all people. It was a story of how one moment of heroism could ripple outward, transforming not just individuals, but entire communities, and proving that the power to change the world lay not in grand gestures, but in simple acts of human decency. This story reminds us that true heroism isn't about the color of your skin, your social status, or the circumstances of your birth. It's about the choices you make when everything is on the line. Samuel's courage didn't just save Catherine's life. It revealed the fundamental humanity that connects us all. In our modern world, we still face floods of prejudice, walls of division, and storms of misunderstanding. But like Samuel, each of us has the power to dive into those dangerous waters and rescue not just individuals, but entire communities from the currents of hatred and ignorance. The question isn't whether we're capable of such courage. Samuel proved that we all are. The question is whether we'll choose to use it. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and share it with others. Sometimes the most powerful way to change the world is simply to remind people of the heroes that walk among us every day. What did you think of Samuel's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what other incredible true stories you'd like us to tell.